Now I want to tell you about contagion, and specifically how the failure of one bank can lead to the failure of other banks. To do so, I'm going to draw two bank balance sheets in an example with 3 banks, but the third bank is just exactly the same as the first two. So let's start with drawing their balance sheet. Let's say we have Bank A, and this bank has a normal balance sheet, so it has some loans, some securities, and some interbank lending. I abbreviate this with IB. They finance it with deposits, with some interbank borrowing, and with capital. Now Bank B looks exactly the same. Bank B it has loans, it has securities, and it has interbank assets, which are financed by deposits, interbank borrowing, and capital. Now, the first mechanism of contagion happens when one bank lends to another. So let's say we write down a few numbers here. Let's say we have loans of 100 and we have securities of 20 and we have total interbank assets of 30, so that the total balance sheet size is 150, and that's financed with deposits of 105, interbank borrowing of 30, and capital of 15. So again, this is 150. The bank has 15 capital to finance 150 in assets, so that's a ratio of more than 10%. And that means that the bank is solvent. Everything is good. Now, some of these interbank loans will be from Bank B, and there's a third bank, Bank C, which is just exactly the same as Bank B, which also lends, which can also lend to Bank A. So we have a closed system here. Now, what happens if Bank A suffers a loss? Let's say some of its loans, and we take an amount of, let's say, 20. So some of their loans fail. Now, if these loans fail, the banking capital will be wiped out because there's only 15 and banking capital has the first losses. So banking capital is gone, which means that now on the interbank loans, the bank suffers a loss of 5 because there's this is all gone. So this is wiped out. And there's still a shortfall of 5, which has to come from the interbank liabilities. Now this means that the bank who has lent to the defaulting bank will suffer a loss on their interbank assets. So there's a part here where the bank now suffers a loss. And again, this loss must be absorbed by capital. Now that this bank has suffered a loss of 5 on its interbank borrowing, this must come from the capital that the bank has as well. And as a consequence, the bank capital is reduced. So it used to have 150 originally as a balance sheet size, but it's reduced by 5. So the new balance sheet size is 145, and the new capital is only 10. So that's the balance sheet size. And the new capital is only 10. If we now compute the capital ratio, it's 10 over 145, and that's smaller than 8%. So as a consequence of this shock, of this loss on its interbank assets that comes from the default of the first bank, the second bank now becomes also insolvent. This is what we call the domino-style contagion. It's a potential threat to the stability of the financial system, because now that this bank has defaulted, you can easily see a situation where Bank B borrowed from Bank C, and now as a consequence of Bank A defaulting, Bank B defaults, and then Bank C defaults, and eventually the whole financial system might collapse. So that's domino-style contagion. It's a risk, and it's only one of the two forms of contagion that are relevant in the global financial crisis. The other form happened not from a loss on the loan book, but actually the other form happened because of a loss in the bank's securities. The second form of contagion works through common holdings of securities. So let's say Bank A and Bank B have securities and they hold some of them in common. What happens now if Bank A suffers a small shock on their loan book? So let's say it's a small shock here of about 10. That shock would not wipe out their entire capital, but it would wipe out 10 out of 15. So the bank capital would be much, much less. And as a consequence, this bank would become insolvent unless they can reduce the balance sheet size. So because of this initial shock, the bank now needs to sell off all their securities, because they are relatively liquid, not perfectly so, but relatively liquid. So they need to sell off all their securities. The securities were worth 20 originally, but this bank needs to get rid of them in a fire sale. So they need to get rid of them in a hurry. So these securities don't recoup 20 when they are being sold off, but let's say they only recoup 18. So that's the new value of these securities as a consequence of this fire sale. So now there's another shock that the bank capital needs to absorb, this time of 2. So this shock, again, eats from the bank capital. So the new bank capital is only 3. What makes the situation worse is that this fire sale that reduces the value from 20 to 18 also applies here. It's the same securities. So the value of these securities is reduced because of the fire sale of the first bank. So there's a small part of 2 that the securities are worth less, and now the second bank suffers a loss of 2 on its capital. So there's a loss of 2, and there's 13 banking capital left. Now this bank also has to liquidate some securities, which exacerbates the fire sale and makes this valuation even worse. As a consequence of this joint holdings of securities, fire sales can erupt and can lead to illiquidity spirals. So that this bank is now faced with a very tough situation. They can't do anything anymore to shorten their balance sheet, because they can't just call in these loans. And remember, these were interbank loans. So they can't just call them in. Now this bank can't satisfy, can't cope with the loss, and they can't deleverage further. So this bank is shut down because it has way too much leverage, and it's over and above the capital that it could hold, so it's undercapitalized. And as a consequence of this, this bank now is in very bad shape because it also has too little capital, and it might face a loss on its interbank assets. So because of this joint holding of securities, we can have a situation where a relatively small initial shock, in this case only of 5 on Bank A's loan book, can lead to a situation where the system still becomes very vulnerable and where the whole system might default as a consequence of a small initial shock. And the 2 ingredients that we needed for this were interbank loans between 2 banks and the common holding of securities. In the global financial crisis, we did see in the run-up to the crisis a substantial increase in the amount of interbank lending. So the one ingredient was there. The second ingredient was the common holding of mortgage-backed securities. So many banks held the same kind of securities, and as soon as these securities started to fail and start to become illiquid because more and more banks were selling them off. Everybody was exposed to the same kind of shock from the securities. So as a consequence of any initial small knock-on shock, the entire system was extremely exposed and turned out to be highly fragile.